It was one of those humid summer afternoons in Atlanta, the kind that makes the air feel thick, heavy, almost like it's holding something back. People moved slowly, fans buzzed in corner stores, and the streets pulsed with quiet life. On the edge of the city, not far from a small park where children played barefoot near a broken fountain, a young woman named Aaliyah stepped out of her car. She had just finished work at the local clinic, a place where she served as a nurse, and often stayed past hours to help patients who couldn't afford care. The sun was still high, but shadows were starting to stretch long, and she was just trying to make it home before sunset. Aaliyah was calm, focused, and didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud. But on that day, just being who she was, a confident black woman walking alone in her own neighborhood, was apparently enough to stir something ugly in others. As she made her way toward the corner market to grab some groceries, a police cruiser rolled up beside her slowly, its tires crunching on the gravel. She barely glanced at it. In a city like this, police presence was common. What wasn't common was what happened next. The window rolled down. There were two officers inside, white men in their early 30s, wearing sunglasses that reflected everything but their intentions. "Hey there," one of them called out, his voice a little too casual. Aaliyah gave a polite nod, keeping her distance. But they didn't move on. They pulled over. One of them stepped out and walked toward her, too close. "You live around here?" he asked. She nodded and pointed toward her apartment building. "I work at the clinic," she added, trying to keep things neutral. But he wasn't really interested in her answers. The other officer chuckled from the car. The tone changed. The questions got more personal, the air turned colder even in the heat, and Aaliyah could feel it. What started as a simple stop was turning into something else entirely. She tried to walk away. She had every right to. But the officer stepped in front of her and said she looked nervous and might be hiding something. Aaliyah froze. Her hands were shaking slightly now, but she stayed calm. "I've done nothing wrong," she said. But that didn't seem to matter. People nearby started to notice. A mother pushing a stroller slowed down but kept walking. A man across the street pulled out his phone but didn't press record. The officers were louder now, demanding her ID, claiming suspicion of illegal activity. Aaliyah, scared but standing her ground, said again that she was just walking home. That's when one of them made a comment, a lewd, uncalled-for remark that crossed every line. Her face flushed with a mix of fear and rage. She looked around, hoping someone would step in. But no one did. She reached for her phone, voice trembling. "I'm calling my father," she said. That made the officers laugh. "Yeah? And who's Daddy gonna call, us?" One of them sneered. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Aaliyah's father wasn't just anyone. He wasn't some neighbor. He wasn't someone they could brush off. Her father was a highly respected federal investigator with powerful ties, someone who had spent years holding crooked officers accountable from coast to coast. And he didn't take injustice lightly, especially not when it involved his daughter. Within minutes, her father's black SUV pulled up to the curb like a storm arriving without warning. The doors swung open, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit, his eyes scanning the scene with a sharp, cold focus that made both officers instinctively take a step back. They recognized him, not just as Aaliyah's father, but as someone they'd seen in briefing memos, internal investigations, and headline-making cases. The man known for cleaning house in departments that thought they were untouchable. And suddenly, those officers didn't seem so brave. But let's pause here for a moment. Let's rewind, not to forget what happened, but to better understand. Why this story isn't just about one girl, or one day, or even just two officers who crossed a line. This story is about how everyday moments, giving a seat to someone in need, standing your ground when you're being wronged, calling on the strength of family, community, and truth, can change everything. Because while this part of the story was unfolding in Atlanta, across the city, in a crowded public bus, something else was happening. A young black teen, maybe 17, stood up to offer his seat to a pregnant white woman who had just stepped onto the packed vehicle. looking tired and overwhelmed. She looked surprised, smiled kindly, and thanked him. It was a simple gesture, one rooted in respect. Most people barely noticed. But that moment, that small choice to do what was right, was about to spark a chain of events that would tie into Aaliyah's story in a way no one could have predicted. Because the woman he helped, she wasn't just anyone either. And the note she handed him as she got off the bus, it wasn't a thank you card. It was the beginning of something that would flip both these stories upside down. And as for those officers, well, when Aaliyah's father stepped forward and calmly asked them to repeat what they had just said to his daughter, one of them actually stumbled backward. The smugness disappeared. The badge didn't protect them now. The uniform didn't shield them from truth. They begged, not just for forgiveness, but to kneel, to explain, to find a way out of what they had brought on themselves. And yet the real reckoning was only just beginning, because this isn't just a story about racism, or justice, or power. It's about what happens when people assume too much and respect too little. It's about how dignity can't be silenced, no matter how many sirens scream or how many uniforms stand in its way. It's about a young nurse, a broken system, a powerful father, and a bus ride that started something much bigger. And it's far from over. Aaliyah stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, watching the scene unfold. Her father, Mr. Nathaniel Ford, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to drain the arrogance from the two officers who had minutes ago treated his daughter like a suspect, like less than human. The officer, who had first approached Aaliyah, the one who'd been making snide remarks, kept swallowing hard as if trying to get his voice back. But it was gone, buried beneath fear and the slow realization that he had made a terrible mistake. Aaliyah's father asked her gently if she was okay. She nodded, still stunned. She had never seen him like this before. At home, he was warm, always cracking jokes, making pancakes on Sundays. But here, he was a storm contained in a man's frame, steady, powerful, and deeply focused. He stepped closer to the officer who had spoken the most, looked him in the eye, and asked again, calmly, "What did you just say to my daughter?" The officer mumbled something unintelligible, trying to backpedal. His partner looked away, hands trembling at his side. The silence around them was thick now, and the few people nearby who had been watching were recording everything. A small crowd had gathered, some of them whispering, some shaking their heads, all sensing that this wasn't just about one bad incident. This was about something deeper, something that had been simmering for far too long. But just before the tension could crack wide open, Mr. Ford stepped back. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. Instead, he took out his phone and made one short call. Aaliyah heard him say a few names she didn't recognize, agencies she wasn't familiar with. Then he ended the call and looked at the officers. One last time. "You'll be hearing from them," he said simply, before turning to his daughter and placing a protective hand on her shoulder. They walked away together, but the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Across town, the young teen who had given up his seat was still sitting quietly near the back of the bus. His name was Jamal. 17, quiet, respectful, the kind of kid who always helped his mom bring in groceries, who held the door open for strangers. He didn't think much of what he'd done, just a small act of kindness. The pregnant woman he had helped, however, had been watching him closely. She had seen something in him, his posture, his politeness, his eyes. As she got off at her stop, she handed him a folded note, smiled, and said, "You have no idea what this means. Thank you." Then she disappeared into the crowd. Jamal unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat. The message was short, but confusing. "You remind me of someone I once failed to help. Don't ignore this call. Use the name at the bottom." Beneath, it was a name he didn't recognize and a number that wasn't local. Jamal sat there holding the note, feeling his pulse quicken. Who was this woman? Why would she write something like that? And what did she mean by "use the name"? Back at home that evening, he showed the note to his mother. She read it twice, then once more. Her face changed. She didn't explain much, just said, "Keep this safe. Some people come into our lives for a reason, even if we don't know why yet." That night, Jamal kept the note under his pillow. Meanwhile, Mr. Ford was sitting in his study, flipping through files and calling in favors he hadn't used in years. Aaliyah was resting upstairs, but he couldn't. The incident had rattled him, not just as a father, but as a man who had spent his entire career trying to build systems of justice that were supposed to protect people like his daughter. And now, those same systems had turned on her. He opened an old drawer in his desk and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of him in uniform, standing beside a much younger version of himself and a colleague, a woman. The same woman who had written the note Jamal received, but Jamal didn't know that. Not yet. In the days that followed, strange things began happening. Jamal started noticing a black sedan parked across the street from his school. Always the same car, never the same driver. Sometimes it was gone by the time he looked again. Other times it sat there for hours. He mentioned it to his mother, but she brushed it off at first. Until one morning the car was in their driveway, and then sped off when she stepped outside. That was the moment she called Mr. Ford. The connection between Jamal and Aaliyah began to form there, quietly, behind the scenes. Mr. Ford met Jamal and his mother the next day in a quiet diner. No uniforms, no briefcases, just three people who had suddenly found themselves wrapped in something far bigger than any of them had imagined. Jamal handed him the note. Mr. Ford read it and didn't say a word for nearly a full minute. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "I know who wrote this," he finally said, "and if she gave you this, it means something big is about to happen." That night, back at the station, the two officers who had harassed Aaliyah were called into a private meeting with Internal Affairs. They were told there was an open investigation into their conduct, not just with Aaliyah, but with other complaints that had mysteriously disappeared over the years, paperwork that had been altered, reports that had been lost. Someone was digging now, and not just inside their department, but it didn't stop there. More names started popping up, other victims, other cases. A pattern. Someone behind the scenes was feeding information to the right people, and at the center of it all were two threads slowly weaving together: Aaliyah's stand for dignity and Jamal's simple act of kindness. The woman on the bus, her identity still unknown to Jamal, had ties to Mr. Ford's past. She had once been part of a major case he worked years ago, a whistleblower who vanished after testifying against corrupt officers in another state. Now, years later, she was back, watching, connecting dots. And it seemed she had chosen Jamal for a reason, but what reason? Why now? And what did she mean by, "Don't ignore this call"? Jamal began to wonder if he was being watched, not just by the car, but by something else, an invisible thread pulling him toward something he couldn't yet see. And Aaliyah, though recovering from the ordeal, couldn't shake the feeling that what happened to her wasn't random, that maybe she had been targeted, that maybe someone had been waiting for her father to react. And just like that, two people, one a young nurse trying to live quietly, the other a teen just trying to do right, were now at the heart of something far more dangerous than either. Could have imagined. The city wasn't quiet anymore. The system was shifting. Shadows were moving. And somewhere out there, the woman with the note was waiting to make her next move. But who was she, and what storm was coming? None of them knew yet. But they were about to find out. Jamal couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept seeing that woman's face, calm, almost sad, handing him that note. His instincts told him this wasn't just about kindness anymore. There was a reason he had crossed paths with her, a reason his name was now tied to people he'd never even met. Something was unfolding around him, and he didn't know how deep it went. At school, he started noticing more changes. Teachers seemed nervous around him. One counselor even pulled him aside and asked if everything was okay at home. Jamal wanted to shrug it off, but deep down he knew something had shifted. The strange car hadn't returned, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, like there were eyes on him in places he couldn't see. Meanwhile, Aaliyah, tried to go back to work, but it wasn't the same anymore. Every time a police officer walked into the hospital, her body tensed up. She kept reliving that moment, being cornered, judged, doubted. Her confidence had taken a hit, but she refused to let fear win. Still, she found herself questioning everything: the justice system, the people meant to protect, and even her place in a city where her safety had been so easily dismissed. Her father, Mr. Ford, hadn't stopped digging. He pulled up old records, reached out to people from his federal days, and quietly began tracing connections. What he found disturbed him. The two officers who harassed Aaliyah weren't just problematic. They were part of a larger group within the department, one that had a history of misconduct, most of it buried under paperwork, loopholes, and silent payoffs. The deeper he dug, the more he realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. One night, Mr. Ford met with a former colleague who now worked in internal affairs. They exchanged information in a dimly lit parking lot, away from cameras and phones. The colleague handed over a folder filled with reports, most of them suppressed or closed without explanation. "These aren't just bad cops," he said. "They're protected. Someone up high is keeping them safe." Mr. Ford took the folder, his jaw tightening. If these officers were shielded, it meant someone with power didn't want them exposed. And if that someone found out what he was doing, things could get dangerous. Across town, Jamal finally decided to call the number from the note. His hands trembled as he dialed. The phone rang twice before a calm female voice answered. She didn't. "Say hello," she said. "You called just in time." Jamal was silent. The voice continued. "I can't explain everything now, but you're part of something important. The name on that note, it's not just a name. It's the password to a document. And that document contains evidence. Photos. Names, dates, things certain people would do anything to keep buried." Jamal's mouth went dry. He didn't understand how any of this involved him. "Why me?" he asked quietly. The woman hesitated. "Because your kindness made you visible. You reminded me of someone I lost, and because I knew they'd never suspect you. But now, they're starting to." The call ended without warning. Back at the hospital, Aaliyah's friend and fellow nurse Tanya approached her with concern. "You know those two cops?" she asked in a whisper. "The ones from the parking lot? One of them came back today. Not to apologize. Just stood outside, watching. I think he's trying to intimidate you." Aaliyah's heart raced. She didn't want to live in fear, but it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that she wasn't. So, she started documenting everything. Dates, times, even names of people who seemed too curious about her. And at night, she talked to her dad more than ever. He encouraged her to stay alert and trust her instincts. Mr. Ford also began meeting with Jamal more often. The teen reminded him of his younger self, idealistic, smart, but still unsure of the world's darker corners. Together, they started piecing together bits of the puzzle. Jamal handed over the note again, and with the woman's cryptic message fresh in their minds, Mr. Ford managed to find a lead. The name at the bottom of the note matched an encrypted archive from an old government database, one that had been flagged and locked for years. But trying to open that archive would trigger alerts. Whoever was behind it would know someone was trying to get in. They needed to be careful. Mr. Ford decided to bring in someone he trusted, a former cyber investigator named Reggie, who now ran a small tech repair shop downtown. Reggie was quirky, always chewing gum, and had a dry sense of humor. But he was brilliant. He took one look at the file and said, "This isn't just classified. This is buried. Whoever locked this didn't want it found." Still, he agreed to help. Quietly, over a few late-night sessions, they started decrypting parts of the archive. What they found confirmed their worst fears.